Okay, the name of this lecture is Other Philosophical Branches. We're talking about how philosophy relates to other philosophical branches. Philosophy of religion is very important to the study of theology. How does theology relate to other philosophical branches? Philosophy of religion is very important here because, of course, philosophy of religion deals with some of the great arguments ever made in the theological tradition. Now, we can talk about philosophy of religion broadly conceived, which of course would abstract away from any particular religious tradition, or philosophy of religion narrowly conceived, which really seems to be concentrating upon the Christian tradition, to a lesser degree the Jewish and Islamic traditions, but a lot of these arguments work in all three traditions. So philosophy of religion narrowly conceived deals with a theism, you know, that there is a God, or a panentheism, that there is God and the world is somehow in God, but God is more than the world. And so-called the monisms of the East, where we would find perhaps all things are Brahman. And of course in the Vedic traditions, the Hindu Vedic traditions, the Upanishadic traditions in India. The idea here is, I mean, they're very philosophical, but it's not a theism anymore, but that everything is God, and that we have to come to realize that. What I'm trying to say here is that we live in a time where we're always sort of abstracting away from our own traditions. So philosophy of religion is becoming more of a philosophical exploration of religion in general rather than in the so-called Western monotheisms. So what I'm talking about here is more philosophy of religion narrowly conceived, where we talk about arguments for the existence of God. And of course you have the classical arguments for the existence of God, the so-called cosmological argument. We find ourselves in being. Everything that is must have some cause or reason why it is. This cannot go to infinity, therefore there must be a first cause or reason why this is, and this we know is God. Now I've conflated a couple arguments there, but I'm just trying to get this off on the table, because Aquinas has an argument for motion and an argument from first cause. They're different arguments, but they're relatable. Anyway, these arguments were available in the tradition prior to Aquinas, who was writing in about 1273. So we could have arguments for the existence of God. One's cosmological, one's the ontological. Argument for the existence of God. This is that the notion of God is that which none greater can be thought. If the notion of God is that which none greater can be thought, it includes the notion of existence. Therefore, if you have the notion of God which that none greater can be thought, God must exist. Now, the only way to make this even remotely plausible to you is to talk about it a long time, and I can't do that. But it may, for all, it's one of the most interesting, I think it's probably the most interesting of these arguments, the ontological argument. Even Bertrand Russell said he had that night when he was walking across the Commons in Cambridge, and he said, "My God, I think the ontological argument is sound." I mean, it really scared the heck out of him. He thought that it was sound. Okay, then we have the so-called teleological argument. The teleological arguments are arguments for first purpose, or arguments for design. You look at the universe and you say there is order in the universe. Order in the universe means that there are the marks of design in the universe. Anything with the marks of design must have a designer, therefore there is a designer. These are often times talked about true as well as arguments that make use of analogy, right? And the idea is, if you look at the universe, it looks a lot like an artifact. Everything that is an artifact has an artificer. Therefore, the universe has an artificer, a builder. Okay, so also when studying philosophy of religion, you would deal with so-called arguments concerning the coherence of the divine predicates. For instance, is God's goodness, which would say that God is supremely good, which one would say that God is not just merely good, but that God must be good. That is, God is necessarily good. That is to say that God is good in all possible worlds. Does that cohere with God being all-powerful? Because it would seem like if God is good in all possible worlds, he is limited in his ability not to be good. He can't sin, see. If he can't sin, he doesn't have the power to sin. So then you get into questions how the omnipotence of God can connect to his omnibenevolence. All kinds of things. The next class of arguments dealing with the problem of evil. If God is all good and God is all powerful and God exists, therefore everything in the universe is either passively allowed by God or actively caused by God. If God is all good, then it must be the case that everything is good. But it doesn't seem like the case that everything is good. Therefore, either God is not all good, God is not all powerful, or perhaps God does not exist. These are very powerful arguments, and of course Lutherans answer this traditionally in a different way. But playing by the standards of reason, these are very tough arguments for the theist. Arguments concerning divine foreknowledge and human freedom. Is it the case that God can know all things, including the future, and the future in some sense being open? Does God's knowledge of all things determine that all things that are must be as they are? And here you get some classical distinctions made in the Middle Ages between the necessity of the consequence and the necessity of the thing consequent. And you try to show that it is the case that God can have foreknowledge of human contingent acts. And let's just say that there are all kinds of people that argue that on either side of this issue. Okay, that's enough for there. Arguments pertaining to religious practice. Is it the case that we do have a knowledge of God when we're in mystical states? What would be the characteristics of these states? Does religious experience justify religious belief? That's the question. And of course, arguments relating theology and science. Those are very interesting class of arguments, and there has been a real resurgence in the literature of arguments and concerns about the relationship of theology and science. Now, when we get over to the area of the philosophy of science, some of you would say, well, how is the philosophy of science relevant to theology? And I'm saying to you that the philosophy of science is relevant in that the philosophy of science really crystallizes its thinking upon the nature of theory. Okay? And when you think about theory, physical theory, for instance, particularly maybe physical theory having to do with unobservables, like pi mesons, for instance, right? Things like that. Hadrons. That starts to seem a little bit like what theologians do. They have theories about lots of unobservables, don't they? And when you think about physical theories, you're going to say, well, okay, these physical theories are consistent with the data, and they, in some sense, interpret or make sense out of the data, or can even predict what things will happen. And if you think about it, that's a little bit like theologians do when they think theologically. They don't want to say, well, I have a theological view here that contradicts human experience. Right? No, that it's going to be consistent with human experience. It's going to explain human experience in some ways. So when we study philosophy of science, we get some chops in thinking about the nature of scientific theory. And these chops that we obtain, I'm a jazz player, so chops means how you play certain things. These chops that we obtain for talking about the nature of scientific theory can be translated over into thinking very clearly about what we're doing when we're writing theological pieces. Now, a raging debate in the philosophy of science has been, and perhaps it always will be, the debate between the so-called realists and the anti-realists. Now, there are different gradations of this, but I mean, a realist is one who would say that the object or event talked about in the scientific theory obtains apart from human awareness, perception, conception, and language. See, that's the realist claim. The anti-realist would say, no, 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 no. We're talking about objects and events here, but they're filtered through the conceptual, perceptual, and linguistic framework of the knower. So they would deny that the object has the determinate contour it has apart from conception, perception, awareness, and language. Human perception, conception, awareness, and language. That, in some sense, the human conceptual, perceptual, linguistic apparatus helps constitute the object. Okay? Well, in theology, we have the same kind of thing. Old school guys thought they were talking about God out there, that their God had a certain nature. They were realists. I think during the time of the Lutheran confessions, during the 16th century, the theologians basically operated on realist soil. After Kant, however, it became very useful and probably the move of choice to be anti-realist with respect to God. For instance, Schleiermacher, the great theologian of the 19th century, said God was the whence of the feeling of absolute dependence. Well, that would not be a realist conception of God. It could be a reductionist conception of God, where you're reducing God to something within human experience, but it might just be an anti-realist conception that says, well, what we're talking about here, in reality, out there, whatever sense we can make of what it is out there, is not going to be how we conceive it, okay? But that's okay, because God is still very important within the whole theological theory. It's a theoretical entity within the theological theory, and that it still is useful, and we can still say the propositions are true. This class of propositions are true in theology, whether God is taken realistically or anti-realistically, and these propositions are false in theology, whether God is taken realistically or anti-realistically. And for some people in theology, then it's not such a big concern whether it's a realist or an anti-realist view, just as many people who are working scientists would say, well, I really don't care about all these issues of realism or anti-realism, I'm just trying to do science. So the believer might say, I'm just trying to believe, I don't want to get into these issues of realism and anti-realism. Okay, philosophy of science is also concerned with the nature of causality and causal laws. Very important. What is the nature of cause? If we want to say that God creates and redeems the universe, normally we would take that to be a causal statement. It would be difficult for God to create something if He didn't bring it about. If it were not the case that God had not done it, it would have happened anyway, you see. So the whole question here of causality comes very clearly into theological focus as well. Because if we say that if God has no causal connection to other things, that God is causally inert, then we have this little problem that we find in philosophy of science. And this little problem is the following. I better write this. In the philosophy of science, we normally take it to be the case that something like the following holds: to be is to have causal powers. Within the philosophy of science, we normally ascribe to things existence and being if they have causal powers. So if we're doing theology and our God has no causal powers, then at least we better know that this is kind of running against the current of how we think about other things. Finally, philosophy of science is useful in understanding any possible causal relationship between God and the universe, because as we understand how natural causal processes work and what the truth of these statements about natural causal processes presuppose, we get clearer on what it would mean to say that God causes something within the universe. That was a heavy slide. Last one in the lecture here. Theology is also relatable to ethics. Many, many ways in which these relate. I only talk about a couple. Ethics asks about the nature of the good and the right. It asks questions of ought, what ought to be. What is it that ought to be, right? Not what is, but what ought to be. And of course, God has traditionally thought to be the highest good. So, I mean, the whole question of theology connects here. God has been thought since the time of Augustine to be the summum bonum, the highest good. And God's will has been thought to be the final, deepest source of ought, right? I mean, if there's anything more ought than natural law, I don't know what it is. In natural law theory, God wills certain things to be the case, such as that people don't commit murder, maybe. And so God's willing of it places upon the universe a certain fundamental oughtedness, if you will. So questions of ethics get us into questions of God in many ways. And of course, the final way I want to talk about here is that in the 20th century, it became very problematic to say that our moral statements, our ethical statements had truth values or truth conditions. They might be expressions of emotion or existential attitude or something, but they don't literally reference what is true or false, because of course we can't run up into anything in the world and find a factual moral state of affairs, it was thought. And this kind of development was certainly part of what's called positivism, which goes back to Hume, and actually there's a Kantian element here as well. But of course, any problems with moral language were immediately seen to be problems with theological language as well. And then A.J. Ayer's great book, Logic, Truth, and something. Anyway, he wrote it when he was only 25 years old. He wrote this book. Ayer, I should at least write the name down. Sorry to blank on the name of the book. That's all right. Ayer argued that all theological propositions are meaningless, right? Just as all moral propositions or ethical propositions are meaningless. So obviously, if ethics has found a way beyond the positivist critique somehow, well then theologians should be maybe paying a little bit of attention to what's going on with ethicists to see how they might find their way beyond the critique that was launched in those days. So this is the lecture on the branches of philosophy and how they might relate to theology. The next lecture is going to deal with Plato. We're going to go to the beginning and talk about all of these things. Thank you for joining us today.